The chapel bell at Wycliffe College does not so much ring as breathe, a long, uneven sigh of iron, through the damp morning carried over the yellowing leaves and narrow lanes like the residue of a forgotten sermon. It had the sound, that morning, of something neither quite beginning nor ending, but simply continuing out of habit. Oxford does that better than most places, preserves the illusion that time is cyclical, like the liturgical calendar or the tides of undergraduate angst. But beneath the sound of bells, something always slips. It was early October. I remember the taste of it, almost wood smoke caught in drizzle, the faint musk of unturned pages in library stacks. I'd left the opera the night before. Der Rosenkavalier, Act 2, not in protest, exactly, but in weariness. There are only so many arias one can stomach when one's companion prefers the company of her own reflections in the interval mirror. I walked out during a string tremor that felt too close to something I didn't wish to name. I found myself the next morning on the banks of the Cherwell, walking without any particular direction, letting my shoes absorb the wet from the grass as penance. A thin mist hung over the water, giving the trees the look of hesitant ghosts. I was thinking, rather predictably, of Eliot. April is the cruelest month, though it wasn't April, and cruelty rarely keeps a calendar. A cyclist passed without a bell. A swan bent its neck in a gesture that could have been prayer or indifference. Back near St. Aldate's, I paused before the entrance to Wycliffe College, which I'd passed countless times and never once entered, tucked behind Christ Church Meadow. Wycliffe was one of Oxford's quieter corners, a theological college with a reputation for introverted scholarship and doctrinal infighting, the sort of place where the arguments are footnoted but never forgotten. I'd once read a monograph by a fellow there on the ethics of imagined sins. The prose had been devastatingly precise and entirely joyless. That morning the porter, name of Hatherley I would learn later, sat behind the gatehouse glass with a cup of milky tea and the Times folded open at the deaths. He marked one notice with a biro that had run dry at the tip. Dr. Adrian Plowright, former Dean of Chapel. Service had been held the week before. No detail given beyond the phrase "suddenly at home." I suppose it's strange, in retrospect, that I remember so clearly the sound of that Bialk scratching at the newspaper. It made me think of old exam scripts and the odd finality of red ink. I walked on, back toward my flat, where the heating worked in theory, and the whiskey, thankfully, required no assistance. The knock came just as I was pouring a measure into a clean enough glass. Not a sharp knock, but deliberate, as if the person behind it resented the necessity of summoning me. Strange stood on the threshold with his hands in his pockets, the rain freckling his coat. "You're not at the opera," he said without particular humor. I stepped aside, without replying. He held out an envelope, no address on the back. "Sent to the station anonymously. The sort of thing we usually ben," he added. But then again, he trailed off. "The sort of letter that smells," I supplied. It wasn't typed, which already made it rare. The handwriting was angular, ascetic. It referred obliquely, but unmistakably, to Plowright's death. The phrasing was almost literary. "A stain upon the soul of Wycliffe," it read, "has not been cleansed but quietly buried." And at the end, a curious line. "A knock was heard, but no one came." "Familiar," I murmured. "Gray? No, not quite. A variation." "The sort of misquotation that masks intent." "Strange," shrugged. "I thought it might appeal to your sensibilities," which, I replied, "are not always sensible." He left soon after, muttering something about budget meetings and the superintendent's fondness for televised confessions. I stood for a while with the letter in one hand and my glass in the other. Plowright. I hadn't known the name, and yet it hung now with the weight of some half-forgotten score. Not music, exactly, but a chord unresolved. I lit a cigarette. I didn't particularly want. The smoke curling like script over the rim of the glass. Wycliffe. A knock. No one came. Some doors, I've found, are easier to open after the final bell. The thing about anonymous letters is that they so rarely arrive without ego. Most are soaked in bile, floridly composed and riddled with a kind of accidental candor, rage masquerading as righteousness. But this one had a coolness to it, as if it had been drafted not in haste but in shame. A literary shame, the worst kind. The ink was black, deliberate, the phrasing precise. I remember reading it 3 times before I looked up. Lewis, standing near my desk with a sandwich he hadn't finished, called it theatrical, said it sounded like someone who read too much and lived too little. Possibly, I said. But we still read them, don't we? Even the ones we know are nonsense. He shrugged and said something about too many people having typewriters and not enough supervision. The letter had no return address. Just a heading, "To whom it may concern at Thames Valley Police," and 5 short paragraphs. No accusations, no specific names beyond Plowright, but there was a tone to it, a heaviness, like someone was writing from the bottom of a well and didn't particularly care whether we dropped a rope. "The soul of Wycliffe College," it read, "has long been in shadow, but now that the vestry is empty and the hymn has ended, I wonder whether anyone still hears what was left unsung." And then the line again. A knock was heard, but no one came. A peculiar turn of phrase. Familiar, but off-key. Gray had written something similar, hadn't he? "The paths of glory lead, but to the grave." Not quite. I reached for the spine-worn Oxford Book of English Verse, and found it. Gray again, yes, but altered. The original line, "The curfew tolls the knell of parting day." No knock, no absence. The letter had invented its own morning bell. I told Lewis we'd be going to Wycliffe. He looked at me the way he does when he knows he's lost the argument before it began. "Just a conversation," I said, "not an inquiry." He muttered something about semantics and fetched the coats. At Wycliffe, the master met us with the slightly damp demeanor of a man who has spent his life in buildings older than his convictions. Edmund Pettifer, late 50s, formerly of Balliol, now clinging to the fading ropes of collegiate tradition like a priest to a pew in a fire. He offered us tea without conviction, and declined to call what we were doing an investigation. We were simply curious. I told him about a death. He stiffened at that. Plowright, he said, had been troubled, yes, but not unhealthy. A deeply spiritual man. He had enemies, like anyone with convictions, Pettifer said. But nothing unusual, academic rivalries. The usual heat without light. He died in the vestry. Lewis prompted. During evensong, Pettifer confirmed, or rather before it. The rehearsal. The choir was dismissed early, sore throats I believe, and Plowright was found later by the organ scholar. A girl named Day, Saskia Day, I noted. A promising musician, I'd heard, though slightly aloof. She'd been offered a scholarship at King's before choosing Oxford instead, a decision that suggested either intelligence or grief, possibly both. The body, Pettifer said, was found slumped in the vestry chair. Peaceful, eyes closed, hands folded on a manuscript. The physician signed the certificate that same evening. Heart failure. No autopsy, I asked. He seemed surprised by the question. It wasn't required. There were no marks, no suspicions, just a man alone in a chair. I murmured. At twilight, I was allowed a brief look at the vestry. Small room, worn chair, a faint scent of dust and incense that hadn't yet faded. Nothing theatrical, just a wall of old hymnals and a framed verse from Corinthians, slightly crooked. But I kept thinking about the organ scholar, the one who'd found him. I asked to speak to her, but was told she'd taken a few days' leave. Exams, said Pettifer, and waved vaguely toward the cloisters. Outside, the sun was turning the stone a shade of bruised gold. Lewis asked whether I truly thought anything was amiss. Not yet, I said. But literary men don't die quietly without leaving footnotes and anonymous letters. I added to myself. Don't quote invented poetry unless someone is trying to confess without forgiveness. Wycliffe was one of those Oxford colleges that felt like it had been built by silence. The kind of place where footsteps echoed longer than they should, and doors closed too softly, as if fearing to interrupt a thought. Even the ivy along the inner walls seemed hesitant, clinging rather than climbing. It was a closed world, but not in the usual sense. Not grandly secretive, but carefully faded, like a letter kept too long in a drawer, its edges browned by inattention. Pettifer met us again that morning in the senior common room. He had the manner of a man perpetually preparing to leave the room, eyes always somewhere near the door. I suspected he found my presence less unwelcome than the possibility that I might stay long enough to matter. He said the college had suffered enough. The phrase came quickly, as if rehearsed, not melodramatic, just weary. Plowright had been, in his words, a troubled but devout man. Difficult, brilliant. One of us in the end. It's always in the end, I thought. That's how they forgive people here, posthumously. And with careful vocabulary. We were invited, or rather permitted, to speak with what Pettifer called the relevant persons. It felt like being handed a wine list at a funeral. Dr. Moira Thorne was the first, a fellow in philosophical theology, and the college's lone concession to the late 20th century. She wore an olive-green scarf and spoke with the clipped precision of someone who edits herself mid-sentence. I asked about Plowright, and she smiled a smile I didn't quite trust. Adrian, she said, was a man who mistook conviction for clarity. They had sparred often, it seemed, on matters of scripture, on student discipline, and more subtly, on the place of women in a college that still referred to its laundry rooms in Latin. She denied acrimony, of course. Said it was always rigorous, never personal. That's the trouble with people who trade in language. They know how to sound honest without being so. Next came Reverend Giles Fawkes, the college chaplain, a tall man with hands too pale for his cassock, and a voice like filtered rain. His sermons, we were told, had grown abstract in recent months. Metaphysical wanderings through guilt, silence, and the geometry of sin. He spoke of Plowright with a softness that veered into reverence. He carried a weight, Fawkes murmured, and wore it as vestment. I asked what the weight might have been. Fawkes looked past me to a stained glass window that hadn't let in proper light for years. Some men, he said slowly, confess only by dying. I let it hang. The best clues arrive in echoes. Last was Calvin Merritt, the student, theology prize winner, amateur poet, resident thorn. He wore disdain like cologne. I liked him immediately, not because he was likable, but because he didn't pretend to be anything else. He described Plowright in 3 words: stern, sentimental, inconsistent. He believed in rules, Merritt said, until they applied to people he admired. Then it became context. I asked about their falling out. Merritt shrugged. He disapproved of my thesis, said it lacked reverence. I told him reverence had no footnotes. Lewis frowned at that, but I felt a flicker of recognition. I'd said something similar once, in a tutorial before life had taught me to redact my instincts. Plowright's office was left mostly untouched. Dust, as always, had its own opinion on time. The desk was orderly, in the way of a man who had long ago stopped expecting visitors. But books, of course, speak louder than furniture. On the bottom shelf, beneath a slumped collection of hymnals, I found 1 volume slightly ajar. Inside, folded once with deliberate care, was a single sheet of paper. Latin phrases, handwritten, some familiar Confessio Peccatorum or a Pro Nobis, but others more curious, theological fragments that felt lifted from older texts. I slipped it into my coat before Lewis saw. He was busy noting the calendar on the wall, still turned to the month before. Outside, the chapel bell rang again, not with urgency, but with that same slow breath. Wycliffe had buried more than a man. It had buried something in language. And perhaps, just perhaps, that language was beginning to stir. The paper was creased only once, neatly, like something not hidden so much as tucked away. A gesture halfway between concealment and quiet invitation. I laid it out on my desk that evening, under the small circle of lamplight that always made my flat feel less like a room and more like a stage awaiting a monologue. The Latin was not church standard. Not the polished, liturgical phrases you'd find printed in the back of an old missal. This had roughness, older syntax, confessio, peccatoris, in nocte mortis. It stirred something in memory, not from scripture, but from the borderlands of medieval literature, where theology starts to sound like poetry. I reached instinctively for Gower, confessio, amentis, not a text often cited in Wycliffe sermons, too human, perhaps, too steeped in the muck and music of ordinary sin. I read the passage twice. Then again, the phrases suggested a man, accounting not to God, but to himself, a voice not seeking forgiveness, but shape. Plowright, I thought, was not researching doctrine. He was following a mirror. At the Bodleian the next morning, I asked for access to the restricted theology list, a favor granted more from long acquaintance than proper protocol. The librarian, a woman with hair the color of ash and a memory like iron, confirmed that Plowright had indeed requested a volume shortly before his death, a facsimile of a 14th-century confessional text, only one copy held in Oxford. It had been marked as collected, though no return slip had followed. Vanished, she said in that dry voice librarians use for sins of the flesh and misfiled books alike. I stared at the entry. The call number ended in 13. Unlucky, perhaps, or deliberate. Numbers mean things when the rest is silence. Back at the station, Lewis had been digging. His version of theology was bureaucratic. He'd found the disciplinary record on merit, buried in a file no longer active, tagged under internal review. The phrase used was moral turpitude, which in Oxford parlance could mean anything from sleeping with a tutor's wife to quoting Derrida in a footnote. No formal charge, just a withdrawal of funding, quiet as a benediction. I visited Merritt that afternoon. His rooms were off the Cowley Road, in a building that had once been a boarding house, and still carried the scent of its former life. Stale curtains, burnt toast, the faint echo of other people's conversations. He answered the door, barefoot, holding a mug of something far too black to be coffee. I asked about Plowright. He looked out the window before replying. He feared something, he said at last. Not me. I'm not dangerous, just inconvenient. Feared what? I asked. A memory, he said, with the kind of smile you don't trust. Or maybe a version of himself he'd tried to unwrite. He offered me no more than that. But he didn't need to. There are men who hate themselves loudly, with drink, with fists. And then there are men like Plowright, who do it slowly in footnotes and pastoral letters. That night, I sat with a crossword, half done. The theme was obfuscation. One clue read, truth held behind closed lips. 8. I tried secrecy, silence, even omission. None fit. I looked again at the paper, its Latin curling at the edges like a leaf left too long in a sermon. Sometimes, the answer is not what is hidden. It is why it needed hiding. I poured another inch of whiskey, left the clue blank, and let the silence settle like ash. There are rooms that carry sound strangely, as though reluctant to surrender it. The chapel at Wycliffe is one such room. The stones soak speech like rain, and what survives is not echo but memory. A kind of residue in the air, like dust you can't quite see. I sat there longer than I had intended, watching the light shift through a narrow stained glass lancet, and thinking not for the first time that some spaces feel closer to the dead than the living. It was Lewis who noticed the ledger. He has a gift for those quiet dissonances that appear when paperwork outlives the people it describes. Even song, the entry read. Scheduled for 7 o'clock the night Plowright died, but no attendance recorded, no officiant, no readings marked, just the title written in that faint institutional ink, like the ghost of a service that never came. We returned to the vestry. The place remained untouched, a small, hollow chamber behind the chapel proper, dressed in its usual damp solemnity. The chair, where Plowright had been found, sat precisely beneath a carved wooden panel, which I had overlooked on the first visit. There was an inscription on it now that caught the corner of my eye, faded lettering in Latin, obscured by layers of polish and time. Adi vocem. Something. The rest worn into obscurity. I stood in the chair's position. You would have faced the panel directly. The kind of gaze that wasn't accidental. A deliberate choice, perhaps. A man seeking something wordless. Saskia Day arrived late. She moved with the light-footedness of someone used to holding her breath. She wore a black jumper that looked one size too small, and her fingers, long and thin, carried the faint scent of resin and practice. I asked again about the night in question. She hesitated, eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder. Then, with a small sigh, she said he had dismissed the choir early. He said he had a visitor. She added after a pause. Who? I don't know. I didn't see anyone. He just seemed unsettled. He told us to leave, told me to lock the south door. And you did. She nodded. He was always particular about sound. Said even silence could be profaned. That, I thought, was the sort of thing only a guilty man says too often. Back at the station, Lewis had unearthed a series of staff photographs from the college archive. The yearly tableau taken with solemnity and wine afterwards. He spread them on my desk, tapping the one from a decade ago. Plowright, though dean at the time, was absent. His absence was conspicuous, a gap where a man should be, explained by no note, no excuse in the college records. Just a year, when the dean vanished behind his title. Why? Perhaps, Lewis ventured, he was ill, perhaps, or unwilling to be seen. I returned that evening to the letter. The phrase again at the end. A knock was heard, but no one came. It had bothered me from the beginning, not for what it implied, but for what it distorted. It wasn't gray, nor was it Doan. It was made to sound like a quotation, which is altogether different. It bore the syntax of antiquity, but none of the precision, a deliberate echo, not a misquote. I read it aloud once, letting the chapel's silence play in the back of my mind. It didn't sound like warning. It sounded like guilt rehearsed into literature. Whoever wrote it had not forgotten something. They had shaped it into something poetic, something survivable. The knock wasn't heard. It was recalled. And recalling, I've learned, is a form of rewriting. Grief has a way of rearranging a room. Not with noise, but absence. The space around a chair left empty. The untouched saucer beside the cold teacup. I've come to see funerals. Not as gatherings of sorrow, but of forgetting. Carefully choreographed forgettings, with flowers and hymns to dress the silence. Most who attend do not mourn, they perform. Lewis had been speaking with the verger, a man with the face of a neglected statue and the disposition of wet ash. He remembered little of the service itself, which he described as short and theologically inoffensive, but he did remember one thing. There had been a woman, he said, alone, sat near the back, left hand pew, green scarf. He offered the color with a kind of apology, as though the fact of the scarf had somehow unsettled the ritual. No name, of course, no register, just the detail, a thread that had no obvious stitch. Back at Wycliffe, no one knew her. Pettifer, when asked, merely blinked behind his spectacles. Moira Thorne looked away, and said perhaps she was an old parish friend, which in Oxford is code for a story someone else has forgotten to tell. I asked to see the chapel's CCTV. The feed was limited. Grainy, monochrome, positioned as if reluctant to witness too much. But it showed the chapel's side entrance, and at 1842 on the night Plowright died, someone entered. A slight figure, no face visible, coat drawn tight, not the usual student amble, not the tutor's casual entitlement, purposeful, hesitant. No one signed in that evening. The image blurred at the edges like a fading photograph, played again and again in my mind. Some truths I've found resist clarity. I returned to Moira Thorne. Her rooms were austere, save for a single shelf of paperbacks arranged in alphabetical defiance. Her scarf from the other day hung on the back of a chair, navy blue, not green. She offered tea. I declined. We spoke of Plowright. She crossed her arms. It ended badly, she said. Years ago, and not worth the dust it would stir now. I asked whether he ever wrote to her. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Adrian wrote to many people. He preferred letters to presents. And did he fear her? I asked. That earned a small laugh, sharp and unexpected. No, but perhaps he feared being understood. A better answer than most would give. But not the truth. There was a silence, as if we had both opened a door we would not step through. That evening, I found myself watching an old film. One of those post-war dramas in which no one smiles fully and even the lighting seems exhausted. I don't recall the plot, some betrayal, some half-earned redemption. But one line stayed. A woman on screen, her face half-shadowed, said quietly, "We forgive what we can explain." I paused the film and wrote it down. Not for the case, for something else. There is a kind of forgiveness that grows not from mercy, but from understanding, the kind that arrives after midnight, when the whiskey has run low and the opera plays in the next room, half remembered. Plowright had written something. I was sure of it now. Not theology, not doctrine, but something closer to confession. And someone, the woman in the green scarf perhaps, had read it. What I didn't yet know was whether she had forgiven him, or simply watched him die. The envelope was pale gray, heavier than usual, sealed with the care of someone who still believed in the sanctity of post. No return address, just my name in a firm, slightly slanted hand, the kind of script one learns in boarding schools or confessions. Inside, a single sheet, neatly folded, a photocopy from the Wycliffe College Chronicle, dated Michaelmas term, 1956. The ink had bled slightly in the reproduction, but the corner was clearly turned, and a faint pencil mark, a scholar's gesture, circled a name in the first column, Benedict Clues. The article was sparse. A second-year undergraduate, reading theology. Drowned in the river Isis after a late-night walk. No foul play suspected, the line read. A promising mind, lost too soon. I stared at the name for some time. Not because it was immediately recognizable, but because it wasn't. Faint, like a melody heard through a closed window. The kind that keeps playing long after the record ends. Clues. I searched the college files again. Plowright's personnel records were thin, as most were from that era, but a line buried in his early career caught my eye. Junior tutor, Wycliffe, 1955. The dates matched. They would have known each other. Tutor and student. One vanished beneath the river. The other, slowly submerged by something unspoken. If Plowright carried guilt, and I was now convinced he had, it may have begun here, not in the vestry, but long before, on a night that left no survivors, only silence. I was still holding the photocopy when Lewis rang. Saskia. They hadn't reported for rehearsal, nor for tutorials. Her flatmate hadn't seen her since the evening before. Her bed, Lewis said, hadn't been slept in. I asked whether she had packed anything. No, he said, but her violin case was gone. We found the flat unlocked, not broken into, simply left open, as if departure had been a decision made quietly, without resistance. The living room was too neat. Nothing smelled of fear, only of deliberate absence. On her desk, beside a mug of tea gone cold, lay a single sheet of manuscript paper. A few bars of music, unaccompanied, unlabeled, sparse notes that hung in the treble clef, like questions. Folded between the staves, a scrap of paper, the kind torn from a church bulletin. The ink was smudged at the edges, but the verse remained legible. Thou hast made me, and shall thy work decay. Dunna. A line from the Holy Sonnets. Not the usual verses chosen by students who want to appear deep. This one spoke not of grandeur, but of doubt, raw, intimate doubt. I read it aloud once as the street lamp cast its light across the piano stool. It did not sound dramatic. It sounded tired. Saskia had known something, or guessed it. She was closer to Plowright than most realized, not by affection perhaps, but by lineage of silence. Clues, Plowright, Saskia. 3 names now bound by water and absence. I held the sheet of music up to the light. The notes were not mournful. They were tentative, like footsteps on old stone. Ghosts do not arrive with clanking chains. They come with unasked questions, with empty chairs, with a green scarf left behind, and sometimes with a song unfinished. They found her in a modest guest house off Iffley Road, the sort of place with ivy on the windows and a breakfast menu from 1978. She had given her name as Sarah Davies, a nod perhaps to her mother's maiden name, and paid in cash, which felt oddly deliberate. She hadn't gone far. But then, one doesn't always run to escape. Sometimes it's to remember in silence. When I arrived, the proprietor, a thin man who over-enunciated his vowels, handed me the key with faint disdain, as though harboring a girl with too much violin and too few explanations had made him a reluctant accomplice to something vaguely continental. Saskia was sitting by the window, knees drawn up beneath a borrowed blanket. The world outside turned gray with drizzle. Her violin case rested on the floor, unopened. She did not look afraid. She looked tired. We spoke slowly, not as questioner and witness, but as two people who knew that names meant little without the silence beneath them. She told me about the diary. She'd found it in the vestry. Red leather, no lock. Slipped behind a row of old prayer books, not hidden well but not left carelessly either. She had meant to return it. She hadn't. Plowright's handwriting, she said, was surprisingly elegant. Not cramped, as one might expect of a cleric with secrets, but broad and looping, like someone who once learned to write letters with intention. The entries were fragmentary. Dreams, mostly. Latin phrases woven with psalms. Guilt that swelled and receded, like a tide that never quite broke. And one night, the evening before his death, she had stayed late to practice. She returned the diary to its place, only to find someone else had already been watching. She would not say who. Not even when I pressed her gently. I saw their eyes, she said. That was enough. Later, back in my flat, I found myself staring at a photograph. The one taken from the old Wycliffe files. No Plowright. No clues, just a hollow where they should have been. Saskia, it turns out, is Benedict Cluse's niece. Her mother, Cluse's younger sister, had died of a fever when Saskia was 10. The rest of the family had rarely spoken of Benedict. A drowning, no scandal, no answers. She had come to Oxford, not merely to study, but to listen, to the walls, the whispers, the unrecorded things, the green scarf, her mother's. Wycliffe is a place where memory lingers, not in archives, but in gestures. A scarf, a note, a missed photograph. I read the diary that night. I do not know who left it in my pigeonhole. Lewis said it had simply appeared. The final page was dated a week before Plowright's death. It was short. The knock came, but I hid behind the light. Not behind the door, behind the light. It is a strange phrase. Not fearful, not entirely evasive, as if the writer still believed in the sanctity of the Vesper lamp, the soft defiance of stained glass. Plowright had hidden not from justice but from illumination, from understanding. He had carried something for decades, something that stained him but not enough to destroy him, perhaps just enough to make him falter at the end. Someone else had seen the diary. Someone else knew what clues had been, what Plowright had done or failed to do. And someone else wanted the silence to remain sealed. But the scarf had been worn. The diary had been opened, and the knock had already come. I returned to the vestry early, before the chapel had shrugged off its damp stillness. Morning light seeped through the leaded windows in long, angular shafts, illuminating dust motes that drifted with liturgical patience. The place had the hush of a tomb reluctant to remember. I brought a screwdriver. Not the usual way of things, but sometimes scholarship requires a touch of heresy. The wooden panel, faded oak, carved with some half-eroded verse from Isaiah, had long seemed odd to me. Not in its presence, but in its placement, too deliberately framed for something so bland. 4 screws, rusted and resistant. They came loose with a quiet groan, as if resentful of being stirred, behind a narrow crawl space. Unlit, dust-heavy, I reached in, my shoulder brushing against cold stone. My fingers found the edge of a book, thick, bound in cracked calfskin, with a missing spine label. The theology volume from the Bodleian. Tucked inside was more than theology. The original coroner's report, yellowing at the corners, the type uneven, the kind of inked clarity only an Underwood could produce. The official copy had stated, accidental drowning, no sign of trauma. But this one told another story. Blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. No water in the lungs. Death occurred before entry into river. A quiet erasure. Words changed, meaning redacted. Folded between the pages, I found a note, torn from a blue-lined exercise book, the kind handed out to undergraduates for Latin translations. Plowright's handwriting. He told me it was an accident. I believed him, because I needed to. There it was, not confession, not exoneration, just need. Need is a quiet, brutal thing. It distorts faith and reconfigures truth. I returned to the 1956 photograph, the one from the common room wall, slightly warped from years in a plastic frame. I had looked at it half a dozen times, but this time I brought a magnifying glass, like some retired philatelist. And there he was, not Plowright, but Fawkes, 10 years younger, a different name below the frame. G.V. Ellison, no clerical collar. A theology student, tall, awkward in the shoulders, with a face you'd forget unless it remembered you first. I thought of his sermons, how they circled a subject like a hawk, reluctant to land. How Saskia had said Plowright feared something but never named it. Fawkes. He'd been there. He had reason. He had theology. He had a lifetime to learn abstraction. The door to my flat knocked softly. The kind of knock that holds news, not politeness. Lewis stepped in, damp from rain, holding a slim folder wrapped in one of those translucent poly covers that never quite keep things dry. He placed it on the table, opened it without flourish. The Wycliffe Registry. 1955. There they were, written in institutional blue. Plowright. Adrian C., tutor in patristics. Clues, Benedict Dairy, undergraduate, second-year theology. Ellison. Giles V. Visiting reader. Ellison. Fawkes. He hadn't vanished. He had changed his name. It happens, sometimes, when people wish to discard not only their sins but the syntax of their lives. Morse. Lewis said quietly. Do you think Plowright knew who he was? I don't know, I replied. But I suspect he knew who he used to be. Outside, the rain had turned cold. It struck the window not with violence but insistence, like something asking quietly to be let in. I arrived late to evensong. The last of the sun had drained from the stained glass, leaving the chapel steeped in an almost private dusk. Candles flickered along the choir stalls, their flames lifting and bowing as if in quiet obeisance to something not wholly present. The pews held few, a don or two, some loyal undergraduates, a widow perhaps. The hush of Wycliffe settled back into itself like breath withdrawn. Fawkes stood at the lectern, robed in black, his voice threading into the stillness. He read from Augustine. Not the more famous confessions, not the road to Carthage or the pear tree. Instead, a passage on the burden of memory, how sin, once buried, germinates in silence. He spoke of guilt as a house with too many doors, each one opening inward. He paused once. Just once. I watched his eyes fall, then lift. That was when I heard it. A knock. Not real, but in his voice. A beat of hesitation that carried the whole weight of something left too long unsaid. The sermon moved on, but the echo did not. Afterward I found him in the sacristy, folding his cassock with the tenderness one reserves for damaged cloth. I asked if he had a moment. He nodded without words. The small office behind the choir screen was too warm, heavy with the scent of beeswax and old books. I stood while he sat. There was no need for preamble. I asked about clues. He looked at me, tiredly. Then, without defense or delay, he told it. They had been young, foolish of course, vulnerable in ways Oxford doesn't protect, especially not in 1956. Plowright had been the steadier of the two, the more cautious. Fawkes, or Ellison, as he was then, had fallen too openly, and Clues had seen. Clues, brilliant and brimming with the arrogance of those who still believe in moral clarity, threatened exposure. There had been an argument near the river. Fawkes claimed he only meant to push him away, not to kill. A stumble, a cry. The stone bank, the silence after. Plowright found him after. Panicked, he believed, or needed to believe, that it had been an accident. So he helped with the story, with the river, with the silence. And then the decades passed. Silence became structure, ministry, college, habit. But Plowright could not bury it indefinitely. When Saskia appeared, asking quiet questions under the guise of music and memory, something in him began to unravel. He gave her the diary, Fawkes said. He wanted her to know. I asked why he hadn't destroyed it. He looked at me with something almost like contempt. Because he wanted forgiveness, Morse. I wanted silence. There was nothing triumphant in it. No cold calculation. Just the exhaustion of a man who had carried one truth for too long and buried another inside it. I didn't arrest him. Not then. I let him return to his pulpit. I told Lewis later, and the machinery of justice began its predictable turn. Affidavits, warrants, press briefings. But that evening, I walked alone back through the cloisters. The air had cooled. The wind moved through the arches in soft phrases, like notes held too long. I took Saskia's music page from my coat pocket. I hadn't meant to bring it, but there it was, fragile, lightly creased. The verse from Donne curled at the top, like a question. Thou hast made me, and shall thy work decay? The page fluttered slightly in the breeze, just enough to make it seem for a moment like something alive. I stood there longer than necessary, not praying, not thinking, just listening. Sometimes a knock comes, and no one answers, and still it echoes. The answer came, without ceremony. I had circled the clue for days, letting it lie among coffee rings and unopened post, beneath drafts of reports I had no appetite to complete. Truth, held behind closed lips, 8 letters. It wasn't cleverness that solved it in the end. Just stillness, a kind of internal hush. Confession. It fit. Of course it did. I underlined the word lightly with my pencil, not so much with satisfaction as acknowledgement. The word seemed to rest there, final and faintly accusatory, as if it had been waiting for me to arrive. I pushed the puzzle away and sat back. Outside, Oxford leaned into its habitual dusk. The spire of St. Mary's turned shadow grey, and the stone along Merton Street took on that particular gleam it only finds at twilight, when the rain holds off just long enough to let the light settle like a secret. On the windowsill the wine Lewis had left me sat unopened. A Côte du Rhône, thoughtful. If a little forward. He'd come by earlier, still in that long-suffering coat of his, saying he thought we ought to toast a resolution. I told him no, not unkindly. Just no. He understood. Lewis has learned how to read the silences. I returned to the desk. The red diary lay open, its spine slightly cracked from use or guilt. I read again the line that had troubled me the most. I built a chapel to hide the boy I was. The hand was Plowright's, angular and urgent. No flourish, just regret, shaped into sentences. I found myself wondering, not for the first time, whether all belief is scaffolding, a structure raised not to worship, but to conceal. Theology, as a language for wounds one cannot name. There was a knock at the door. I didn't move, not out of obstinacy, just inertia. Perhaps it was Lewis again, returning to press the wine into glasses and offer one of his careful observations that always ended in a question. Or perhaps it was no one. A draft, a neighbor, the postman rehearsing tomorrow. The knock didn't come again. Instead, I took down the poetry volume I had left open by the bed. John Clare, I think. Or was it Herbert? The spine was too worn to read without glasses. I turned to the marked page and read aloud, softly, to no one. The act felt almost ritualistic, not dramatic, not sentimental, just a voice making itself known. Forgiveness asks only to be heard. The line floated for a moment, then fell, not into silence, but into stillness. I closed the book. The room darkened slightly as the clouds moved in. The wind stirred against the window panes, with the tired sound of a city that had spoken too much and not enough. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, the first chapel bells began again, faint but firm, evening returning to itself. I poured no wine. I made no calls. I sat, listening, letting the echo remain.